Sri Aurobindo's The Life Divine, Book 1, Chapter 2 and 3, a summary and explanation. Good evening, this is Chris speaking. Wake up with the second video about Sri Aurobindo's The Life Divine, one of his main works. This time about Chapter 2 and 3. I will summarize and explain the two chapters together because they belong together. They're both called the two negations. The second chapter is called the two negations, the materialist denial. And the third, the two negations, the refusal of the ascetic. We have seen in the last video the human mind, with its tendency towards duality, is likely to fall into extremes. In most modern cultures and civilizations, the two extreme opposed viewpoints on the basics of what is reality are materialism and idealism. Materialism discards anything that cannot be perceived by the five senses and cannot be grasped by dual logic, which has led us, by the way, to the present crisis of economy, politics, health, environmental destruction, and so on the one hand, but also towards high tech on the other hand, like the cell phone or the computer you're using right now. It's also an achievement of materialism. Idealism is the view that all matter is just a projection of consciousness, and what can be grasped and perceived by the five main senses is not more than 1% of what can be experienced by other mental and sensory faculties. Now, these two ideologies, because that is what they are difficult to reconcile. And no compromise can be reached, for they accuse each other of being totally wrong and utterly flawed to the core. So, what is the solution? In the second and third chapters of The Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo tries to answer this. It is an important basic step to solve this riddle, because it's also many people have stopped reading this book here, including myself when I tried to read it the first time, seeing only vague philosophy. But we have seen in 2020 what happens if this question is ignored for too long, like our ancestors have seen during countless wars. This is no mere theoretical trifle or hair splitting. This is ground zero. This is the foundation of all human thought, and human beings like to think. That is a main problem that cannot be ignored. Moreover, humans are victim to the Dunning-Kruger effect. I will make a video about that separately. And they think that their thinking is what makes them special and even superior to all other beings. So we have to have a look at the principle of this famous thinking. For it often leads into dead ends, and we have to resolve this first, or at least be aware of it. And not a compromise. A compromise is not a solution, it is a bargain. Both views are really negations. Materialism is a negation that there is more, and idealism is a refusal or negation that this is all there is. For materialists, we are intelligent animals, subject to physical laws and mathematics. For idealists, we are aspects of the divine who have forgotten what we really are, or who we really are. The materialists have an easier field because they can deny soul and spirit by saying that those are not visible and not measurable by machines, and thus do not exist or are not important. Yet we can see today that physics, the main bastion of materialism, is struggling with this. More and more entities are actually invented to explain all kinds of invisible forces that must be there somehow, somewhere. For example, black holes, antimatter, dark matter, wormholes, superstrings, photons, and more super small subatomic particles. Never ends. Even time and gravity seem to influence and warp each other. So you can call it the divine, or you can call it dark matter, or something else entirely. But something is there, and we humans like to assign names to everything. So it doesn't really matter how we call it, but something is there. While the idealists may say that all matter is actually energy or consciousness, and that all matter can be influenced and changed by consciousness, they will quickly encounter practical limits in their lives. The solution is not asceticism and withdrawal, which are the ultimate consequences of idealism, just as the ultimate consequence of materialism is destruction and oppression. The idealist wants to be free, break free from death and rebirth, wants to disappear into nirvana and never ever come back, escape samsara. While the materialist tries to build a secure fortress so he or she can feel safe forever. They amass all kinds of things like houses and bank accounts and cars and so on, insurances to feel safe. The materialist wants a carefree life by whatever means necessary, even if other people suffer for it. The idealist denies life, on the other hand, and would rather die and focus on a sort of afterlife than to live a vulgar life without any higher meaning. The materialist tries to control and subjugate the world. The idealist tries to control and subjugate his own mind and universal consciousness. Both are flawed. Both are flawed in their mistake of seeing themselves as the master of the universe. Instead of trying to possess or dominate something, the solution is to be open for being possessed by a much vaster force. The unity we so long for in one way or another cannot be achieved by forcing it upon nature, because we are smaller than nature. The Vedic wisdom that all is the divine does not mean that matter does not really exist, but that matter is also the divine and that the divine is also matter. And just as we as humans are striving upwards towards the divine somehow, the divine is also striving downwards towards us, its own manifestation, stretching down, as Sri Aurobindo says, and embracing us, picking us up, lifting us up, us and all life. The divine exists and it is extending towards us. We are both matter and consciousness. We are both body and mind. It doesn't make sense to create a separation there. So both views, materialism and idealism, are also basically correct, but not in their exclusive extreme. They are two sides of the same coin. The materialist sciences have their place and value, and the internal psychological sciences like yoga and meditation also have their place and value. We do not have to choose either or. Yet the idealistic perspective cannot be ignored. We are not just rocks. We can ignore the materialistic view without creating havoc, but not the idealistic view. For without it, we live in a world without meaning, like now, where only buying stuff seems to bring joy. Matter exists, but it is the presentation of force which is most easily intelligible to our form of intelligence and our frequencies of sight and sound. We interpret matter through and by our faculties. We do not perceive it directly, cannot perceive it directly. Matter is force expanding in space-time. Matter is the result of this expanding in space-time, and we can see the result easily, but not so easily the force behind it. To understand this force, we cannot rely upon dual logic and machines. Sooner or later, the moment arrives in which we have to use all our faculties and look within. and examine what is mind and what is consciousness, really. And for this, we do not need renunciation. We do not need rejection or denial or negation. We do not need to live alone in a cave or in the forest or in the mountains. A certain amount of agnosticism and atheism is the final truth of all knowledge, but not all of it. The universe appears to be at the very end of each and every and whatever path to be an unknowable reality, which translates itself to our senses into physical values. Our senses translate them into physical values, and this is what we perceive as reality. But it is no adequate solution to say that because it is unknowable in its entirety, that we must therefore ignore it. Nor is it an adequate solution to ignore the physical values we perceive, or our body and our physical needs. We don't have to ignore anything. Just because it seems to be difficult doesn't mean we have to ignore it. If there is something visible, then we can focus on it. And if something is invisible, then it is important to focus on it as well. Not exclusively, but also to incorporate it, and not all. At least as important to focus on as we like to do on the visible. Just as we know in psychology, for example, today, that the subconscious part is much larger than the conscious part, the tip of the iceberg is the smallest part of the iceberg. The bulk of it is underwater and much, much larger. The invisible aspect of creation cannot be ignored. Nor does it make sense to ignore it, just as it doesn't make sense to ignore the visible part, the tip. The atom, for example, consists of more than 99.99 and so on % of so-called emptiness. But what is this emptiness? Only recently physicists have come to the conclusion that they must know this as well. What is this stuff in between those subatomic particles, between the core and the electron clouds? The same goes for the physical universe. Why focus on the stars and planets and moons only? Or the asteroids? What about the space in between, which is much larger? What is this so-called empty space? How can we possibly ignore 99.9999999% of everything in existence? And at the same time, why ignore the 0.000000001% we can easily see? We can observe and examine and experience both. Pure spirit is manifested in the mold and condition of matter. We don't need an inauthentic compromise, and least of all, an artificial self-made contradiction. The quarrel is fake and unnecessary. We have found the true meeting place already, where matter becomes real to spirit and spirit becomes real to matter. And this meeting place is the very topic of the following chapters of the Life Divine. This is it for today. Thank you very much to my patrons. Thank you very much for subscribing or sharing the videos with your friends. And see you soon with the next chapter.